Imagine being in a small, isolated town, surrounded by a dense and mysterious forest, where dark legends never die. Now, picture a simple glance through the window, and there, among the trees, something is watching you, a tall, slender, faceless figure. You try to run, but the more you flee, the closer it gets. This is the story of Emily, who stepped into a living nightmare while investigating the legend of Slender Man, and discovered that some things aren't just myths. He might be closer than you think. If you're a fan of real horror stories and eerie urban legends, get ready to dive into a dark mystery. Don't go anywhere, because this story will make you think twice before looking out your window at night. The wind blew cold through the tall trees surrounding Emily's new house. She gazed out at the desolate landscape from her bedroom window, still adjusting to the isolation of the small town her family had moved to. The dense forest surrounding the place seemed to swallow up all the sunlight, making the afternoons gloomy and the twilights even shorter. The few neighboring houses were far apart, and almost no one was ever seen on the streets. All of this was new to her, but the move had been necessary. At least, that's what her parents said. A fresh start, they said. However, to Emily it felt more like an exile. On the first night, as she tried to settle into her bed, she heard a faint creak coming from downstairs. The house was old, full of noises she had yet to distinguish. Every floorboard creak sounded like a distant footstep, and the strong wind outside mixed with strange sounds as if something was moving through the forest. She turned in bed, restless, trying to push the thoughts away. It's just the sound of the wind, she told herself. At school, it was much the same. There were few students, and the small community seemed to live under a kind of complicit silence. Nothing really happened, at least at first glance. However, during break, she overheard something that caught her attention. Two older students whispered about an old local legend, something about the disappearance of some children a long time ago, last seen in the forest near where her new house now stood. "It's just a myth," one of them said, nervously laughing, "but people still talk about it." Emily's curiosity was piqued, but she pretended not to have heard anything. When she returned home, she decided to explore her room further. The house had an old air, as if it held secrets long forgotten. While opening drawers and boxes left behind by the previous family, Emily found an old journal. The pages were yellowed, and the name on the cover was faded, but curiosity led her to flip through it. The first pages were ordinary, detailing the daily life of a teenage girl who seemed to have lived there many years ago. However, some entries further along caught her attention. The young author wrote about a slender man who would appear in the distance, always standing between the trees, watching her house. She described feeling a heavy presence, a sensation of being watched, without ever clearly seeing who or what it was. "He's following me," the last entry read. Emily closed the journal with a chill down her spine. She tried to shake off the discomfort, telling herself that it was all just the imagination of an adolescent mind. After all, it was just a story. Or was it? That night, after finding the journal, Emily couldn't sleep. The old resident's account echoed in her mind. "He's following me," she thought repeatedly. The house, once silent, now seemed full of sounds. The wind beat against the windows, and every rustle of the trees outside seemed like the harbinger of something dark. Determined not to be swayed by superstition, Emily grabbed her phone. She decided to look up information about the legend her classmates had mentioned and the Slender Man described in the journal. Quickly, she found a forum dedicated to local urban legends. The name Slender Man appeared frequently in the posts. Some said it was just a modern myth, something created on the internet. But other accounts were disturbingly detailed, describing sightings of a tall, thin, faceless figure watching from a distance, always in the shadows. A recent post caught her attention, sighting near the southern forest close to town. There was a photo attached, grainy and poorly lit, but when she zoomed in, she could make out something at the edge of the trees, a slender, undefined figure. Her heart raced. She closed the forum, turned off her phone, and tried to forget. "This is nonsense," she whispered, but the images continued to dance in her mind. The wind seemed to howl louder, and she felt the familiar sensation of being watched. Trembling, she got out of bed and looked out the window. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The night was dark. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and the moon shone timidly through the clouds. But then, in the distance, something moved, a long, thin shadow among the trees. Emily blinked, trying to focus, but the shadow had already vanished. Her heart raced, and she quickly stepped away from the window. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, fueled by the stories and the old journal. But the feeling of being watched refused to go away. Back in bed, Emily curled up under the covers, feeling vulnerable. As much as she tried to push away the fear, something inside her knew that the shadow, that presence, wasn't just a product of her imagination. The silence that reigned in the house seemed on the verge of being shattered by something much deeper and darker. That night, sleep came late, and even then, it was disturbed by dreams in which a tall, faceless figure watched her, always from a distance, always present. The following days passed by in a blur, but for Emily, the feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger. Everything around her seemed off. The forest surrounding her house felt darker, as if the trees were hiding something. She could no longer walk through the streets of the town without feeling invisible eyes on her, even when no one was around. At school, the conversations about the Slender Man continued. Some students spoke of him as a joke, an absurd legend created by bored teenagers. But others seemed to talk with a mix of fear and respect, as if there was some truth to the rumors. Emily no longer knew what to think. Back in her nightly routine, she couldn't resist the urge to keep researching. The forum about Slender Man seemed to have a magnetic effect on her. Each time she logged in, there were new posts, recent sightings, and chilling theories. "He feeds on fear," one message read. "The more you think about him, the more real he becomes." Another message, written by an anonymous user, was even more disturbing. "He's closer than you think." The words echoed in her mind. Emily started to feel that everything was connected somehow. The forest, the journal, the stories she had overheard. It all led back to that presence, that tall, slender shadow she had seen from her window. And though she tried to ignore it, she knew it was affecting her. At night, the nightmares intensified. Always the same scene. She was alone in the forest, surrounded by trees, with the wind whispering her name, and he was there in the distance watching. The Slender Man, his face, or lack thereof, terrified her. Emily woke up in cold sweats, her heart pounding. More and more, the line between dream and reality seemed to blur. Objects in her room began to move. Small things, a pen, a notebook, a book, appeared in different places than where she had left them. At first, she thought it was distraction or a result of her frayed mental state, but soon realized it couldn't be a coincidence. That night, As she opened the forum again, another anonymous message appeared. "You've seen him, haven't you?" Emily froze. Who could know? Who else knew what was happening to her? She glanced around the room, feeling exposed, and a wave of panic washed over her. Was she losing her mind, or was he really getting closer? The forest increasingly felt like a living presence, as if it was calling Emily into its secrets. Every night, the sensation of being watched grew stronger. The air around the house was heavier, almost oppressive. The trees seemed to whisper things she couldn't understand, but that drew her in like a magnet. That night, tired of being consumed by doubt and fear, Emily decided she needed to confront whatever was haunting her. Without telling her parents, she grabbed a flashlight and left the house, her steps echoing on the wooden floor as she crossed the hallway. Each step seemed to echo louder than usual, as if the house itself was trying to stop her from leaving. But she didn't stop. When she reached the edge of the forest, Emily hesitated for a moment. The trees were immense, dark, and tightly packed, like guardians of something terrible. The cold wind blew sharply, carrying with it that familiar murmur she had begun to fear. Yet she took the first step. As she walked along the barely lit path, branches snapped under her feet, and the sounds of the forest seemed amplified. She felt invisible eyes on her, the weight of the darkness growing thicker with every step. Emily looked around, the flashlight trembling in her hands, but she could see nothing beyond the shadows of the trees. The silence was unnerving, as if the forest was waiting for something. However, as she ventured deeper, the whispers began. At first, they were low and indistinct, like the wind passing through the leaves. But then, they became clearer. They called her, as if an ancient and distant voice was summoning her presence. Emily, the voice was almost a distant moan. She stopped, panting, trying to focus the flashlight in the direction the sound came from. Nothing, just darkness. The flashlight began to flicker, and she felt her heart race. Around her, there were markings on the trees, symbols she couldn't decipher. Circles, distorted figures, as if left by something inhuman. And then she saw him. In the distance, between the trees, the tall and imposing figure. He stood still, unmoving, watching. Even from afar, Emily could feel the crushing weight of his presence. Fear seized her body, but her legs felt rooted to the ground. She knew she had to get out of there, but she couldn't move. The Slender Man was closer than ever. Emily stood frozen, the fear suffocating her. The air around her seemed to vibrate with the presence of the slender figure standing still among the trees. The Slender Man was only a few meters away, his long legs and arms blending with the surrounding darkness. He didn't move, but his presence was overwhelming, as if time had slowed down just for her. She tried to look away, but something held her gaze, as if she were hypnotized by that faceless figure. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her body wouldn't respond. The whispers around her grew louder, more intense. The words were indistinguishable, but the feeling that they were directed at her was undeniable. It was as if the entire forest echoed his presence, surrounding her, trapping her. Finally, Emily's legs responded, and she took a step back, her heart racing. But when she looked again, the Slender Man was no longer in the same place. Her stomach churned, and the flashlight in her hands began to flicker. The beam of light wavered, allowing the darkness to expand around her. And then, in the blink of an eye, he was closer. The Slender Man didn't seem to move in the conventional sense. He was simply closer, as if the distance between them had evaporated in an instant. His tall, thin figure now dominated Emily's vision, and she could feel the terror pulsing through her veins, each heartbeat echoing in her ears. She felt tears welling up in her eyes, panic overtaking every fiber of her being. The whispers were now deafening, disconnected words, barely perceptible, but they wormed their way into Emily's mind, corroding her sanity. Give up, accepted. There is no escape. Her mind fought to stay in control, but the presence of the Slender Man was overpowering. It was as if he were inside her, not just physically in front of her. In a desperate act, she spun on her heels and began to run, her feet barely touching the ground, stumbling over roots and branches that covered the forest floor. The world around her seemed distorted. The trees now seemed to move, closing in around her like a living trap. Every time she looked back, she expected to see him there, inches away, but there was nothing, only shadows. Her breath was ragged, her chest burning from the effort of fleeing. But no matter how fast she ran, the sensation of being followed was ever present. She knew he was there, near, always lurking, waiting for the right moment to reappear. When she finally reached a clearing, Emily came to an abrupt stop, panting and disoriented. Silence fell over the forest. She looked around, but there were no signs of life, nor of the slender figure that had been terrorizing her. Yet deep down, she knew she hadn't escaped. The Slender Man didn't need to hurry. He had her, somehow. Emily awoke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the trees around her. Her body ached, her muscles tense, as if she had been running for hours without rest. Confused and disoriented, she looked around. She was lying on the forest floor, alone. What had happened? Her mind was foggy, the memories blending between reality and dream. Everything felt so distant, as if she had been in a trance. With great effort, she stood up. Her clothes were dirty with soil and dried leaves, her feet sore. Stumbling, she began to walk toward the house. With each step, her mind tried to piece together the events of the previous night. The Slender Man, the whispers, the feeling of being hunted. It all felt so real, but now, in the daylight, everything seemed like a blur. When she finally crossed the threshold of her home, her parents rushed to her, their faces full of concern. "Emily, where have you been? We've been searching for you all night," her mother said, her voice trembling. She didn't know how to respond. All she could do was shake her head, trying to understand what had really happened. "You've been missing for 2 days, Emily," her father added, his look weary and worried. 2 days? Emily felt panic rising. She couldn't remember anything beyond that night in the forest. How could she have been gone for so long? She tried to explain what she remembered, but the words came out confused, disjointed. Her mother attributed everything to a possible stress-induced episode, but Emily knew it wasn't that simple. There was something more. She couldn't shake the feeling that the Slender Man was still with her, somewhere lurking. Even in the comfort of her home, in the safety of her parents, Emily felt that the forest, and the figure that dwelled within it, would never truly leave her alone. The following days were a constant struggle for Emily. The feeling of being watched never went away. Even in her own home, with the doors locked and the curtains drawn, she felt the invisible gaze, as if the Slender Man was always lurking, ready to reappear. Every noise, every movement of the shadows put her on edge. Her parents tried to convince her that everything that had happened was just the effect of stress and isolation. But Emily knew it wasn't that simple. There was something deeper, something that couldn't be explained rationally. She felt as though she was being pulled back into that dark world of the forest, a place where the Slender Man ruled, a place where reality and nightmare intertwined. One night, while trying to focus on something mundane, like browsing the internet to distract her mind, Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Her heart raced when she saw a notification from the forum where it all began. It was a new anonymous message sent directly to her. "Did you think you could escape me?" Her eyes widened, panic settling in her chest. Who could know? Who was behind this? She clicked on the message, her hands trembling, but there was nothing more. Just that warning. It couldn't be a coincidence, not when everything around her felt heavier, as if the darkness was closing in again. Emily slowly got up and walked to the window hesitant. As she gently pulled back the curtain, she saw in the distance, among the shadows of the forest, a tall, slender figure, perfectly still, watching her. He had never left, and she knew he never would.